our series. This is the first of 7 talks. Tonight's talk will be about seeds, the propagation, seedlings, potting on, and hardening off stages. The talks are sponsored by the Dublin City Council, and we thank especially Rob Chester, Senior Community Officer there, for his support. Our speaker tonight is Fiann Nualláin, aka the Holistic Gardener. He's trained in horticulture, herbalism, nutrition, and mindfulness, and many other things related to those. He's an award-winning gardener and an author of several books. He also has a weekend column in the Irish Examiner and has appeared on many TV shows. For tonight's talk, Fiann will talk for about 40 or 45 minutes, and then we'll take questions. You can type your questions in the Q&A box during the talk, and I'll group the questions and field them for Fiann then for about 15 or 20 minutes at the end. We won't be taking live questions for this first webinar, except through the Q&A box, which you can type in. And also we have the chat box open there for now, in case you need to send a comment to the group or to check on anything that Fiann said that you might have missed. But without further ado, over to Fiann. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. So tonight's course or chat, really, it's about seeds. So it's looking at seeds from a very practical viewpoint. And the way we'll run these sessions is I'll talk about it in terms of if you were a complete novice and I'm trying to explain how you do it. But then I will also include in the expert tips that I've picked up over the last 20 to 30 years of gardening. So despite all the stuff I do, my background is in social and therapeutic horticulture and medicinal botany. I get the opportunity to work every now and then with DCC and groups such as yourself to look at practical gardening and get into the nub of some of the horticultural tricks and techniques that you can do to improve your gardening or improve your community. And it's interesting that tonight we're starting off with seeds because that's, in essence, that's really the grounding of gardening. I mean, lots of people enter into gardening as a aesthetic thing. They want curb appeal, or they want an extra room that they can go and sit out in and have a glass of wine. But that's the artifice of gardening. The actual practical benefits and kind of first part of call of gardening is to be able to propagate and grow on your own plants. And over the course, we'll learn many of the techniques. In terms of seeds, seeds are often seen as tricky, but in a way, seeds are very easy because seeds are programmed to germinate. That's what they're there to do. That's what they're completely designed for. Now, some seeds will do that relatively easily. Other seeds need to be tricked a little bit, and that's what we'll talk about tonight. So in terms of seeds, seeds would have, in terms of their general makeup, seeds will have an outer coat, and that can be various different thicknesses and various different substances, and I'll explain that in a moment. And then inside the seed, like if you think of a pea, it has its outer green shell, and then inside every seed, there is what's known as the embryo, which is the DNA contained for that to turn itself into a pea, a sweet pea, a viola, wherever the seed is you're sown, and a thing called the endosperm. And the endosperm basically is its battery power, its food source that will enable it to survive without needing nutritions or any other factors for anything from several weeks to a month or so. And the endosperm means basically that your seed is already charged. You're not having to feed it when it germinates and comes in. You're not having to have complicated nutrients contained within the soil. It's already there, it's ready to go, which is why seed can be sown even on something like a paper towel or on top of sand or with vermiculite. Now, again, we'll come back on all of these sort of stuff, but basically it just means that your seed is ready to go if you give it the right conditions required for it. And not necessarily that each seed is different, but different plants require a different set of triggers to get it to germinate. So the germination really is where the seed transforms and starts to grow, where it breaks out of its dormancy. Now, you hear dormancy a lot when it comes to seeds. Not every seeds are dormant. So some seeds will germinate in the green, and other seeds germinate later on after a period where they've dried. And in the drying process, where they get either a hard shell coat or a soft shell coat, or a coat that may have what's called a gloom on it, which is kind of a dusty powder. All of that process is there to time program the seed to give it an advantage to survive. So seeds that germinate in the green are seeds that after the flower is fertilized, the seed head forms, the seed can fall fresh on the ground, and once it gets a bit of sunlight, or it is moved down into the soil layer by a beetle or macroorganisms or falling leaves or whatever, and it reaches its optimal growing conditions, it will take off. So if you think of stuff like, cleavers and things like that, the burrs that kind of stick to the leg of your trousers when you bring the dog for a walk or whatever, they're in the green. How they transfer themselves is they have the burrs to stick to animals and humans, and they get to go a distance, they fall off, and they generally germinate straight away. Other stuff, like if you think of Himalayan balsam, which grows a lot along the canals and in waste grounds, it has this wonderful thing where it has an explosive seed capsule, and it can fire its seeds 2 to 3 meters away. So if you think of this thing of kind of, and I'll come back to it when we're looking at spacing the seeds, but it's that thing where, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. That's not great for orchards, because that generation will grow up underneath its parents. They will crowd each other out, and they will become less viable in terms of flowering and fruiting, because they're not getting air moving through, they're competing for light, they're competing for water. So seeds need to be spaced out in various different ways. So lots of the ones that would form in the green, they may be more annual seeds. They come up, they last a year. It doesn't matter that they fall close. It doesn't matter that they germinate after they flower. That's grand. That's their life cycle. Where most of the perennial seeds and most of the seeds as GIYers and such, in terms of your edible crops, most of those would be perennial. And in that means that what they're looking to do is they're looking to get beyond the season that they have seeded in, and to get through winter time into spring of next year. So very often what happens there is the seed dries out. So it's no longer in the green, it's no longer a fleshy seed. It may be, like your grain of rice, for example, or it could go up as large as canna seeds. Now, canna seeds are really, really interesting because they're also known as Indian shot. And in one of the Indian mutinies, when they ran out of bullets, they used the canna seeds in the muskets to fire. Now, I don't know if it was the British using them on the natives or the natives using them on the British, but it's just another ingenious use of kind of plants for something beyond their initial purpose. But that shows you how hard the seed was. It was hard enough to be put into a musket. It was hard enough to survive a powder keg firing, and it was hard enough to penetrate the other human, So there's a trick to making that germinate. And again, I'll come back to these little tricks and tips depending on which seed type you have. But these seeds that harden up, that's a mechanism where they need to break down over a period of time to get them into the season of germination. So most of the perennial seeds and vegetable crops, because they would set flower over summer and then set seed in autumn, they want to hang on over winter and get into the warmer weather. So this is what seeds require. They require a degree of light or non-light. They require a moisture, and they require warmth. So in terms of light or non-light, some seeds that would in the green fall straight away would germinate in sunshine. Others require to be buried. Most of the ones that would have a hard coat or a gloom on them, they generally tend to be buried under the soil. And the fact that they have spent a year, that gloom or that hard coat slowly but surely breaks down, and that allows the moisture and the warmth to get into the embryo and let the embryo then send out roots and send out shoots. So it won't be activated, it won't germinate until it gets those conditions. Now, your seed packet will tell you on the back of the seed packet pretty much all of the information you need to know about stuff. But the seed packet will tell you on the back, if it says sow your seeds on top of compost, that means that it requires light to germinate. So that means that's good on a sunny windowsill, that's good in a lean-to or a cold frame, but you don't just surface sow, leave it as it is. It requires the light. Once it gets to the right level of moisture, once it gets to the right temperature that it requires, and again, different seeds need different temperatures, and it'll say it on the back of the packet, and I'll come back to that, it will then kick off and start. If it says something like dust with vermiculite, well, vermiculite is a volcanic ash, and it's a very fine little particle that allows light to come through. So you may dust over the top of your sown seeds with this vermiculite. The light still gets through and refracts around, but the seed is kind of protected. It's not going to blow away, or it's not going to be picked at by birds, or the slugs crawling over it won't get at it, and it will still germinate. Sometimes your seed packet says plant to the depth of. So the traditional rule of seeds is wherever the width of the seed is, just in case you don't have a seed packet, say you saved your own or you got some from a friend or a neighbor, whatever the width of the seed is, double the depth of that is generally what you plant as a general rule. Now, sometimes you may get something on a seed packet that it says plant an inch or plant 30 centimeters or whatever. That's the optimal depth at which it will grow to be able to send out its shoot and send out its radical root into the ground. So your depth, just like planting a plant in the garden, if you plant too deep, your plant may put on lots of leafy growth, but never flower or never fruit. If you plant too shallow, the top surface of roots are too exposed, it can get into wind rock and move around. Seeds, we can sow them indoors, we can sow them outdoors, but it's the depth is the next kind of key to where you're going. And all of that's contained on the back of the seed packet. If it's not, remember the rule of kind of double the width. Some seeds are very finicky, very tiny. And again, you'd be hard pushed to trying to figure out, well, what is double the depth? Because double the depth, you're not going to need a pencil or a dibber to move it. If it's a tiny little seed, sow it on the top surface. Say something like Nigella seed. Sow it on the top surface, and then just give it a dust and get some compost between your hands and give it a dust and a compost, and that should secure it in. Different seeds have different viability, which means that their life cycle after they formed can be various different lengths. So it's not just that they are designed to wait until the next optimal season. Some of them are designed, again, like this apple falling from the tree, it's about spacing out the generations. So something like carrot seeds, which are biennials, as in it flowers the first year, it sets seed the next year, then the following year the seeds will germinate and it starts that cycle again. But carrot seeds will keep for 2 to 3 years in a foil pack. And most of your vegetable seeds will keep up to, they're best within the first 2 years when you get the package. After that, the germination rate goes down. So when you sow your package in year 1, you might get anything from 60 to 90% success rate of seeds. By the time you get to year 2, that could be 60%. By the time you get to year 3, that could be 2 little seedlings, So the quicker you sow those sort of stuff, the better. But things like, poppy seed and things like that, generally the weeds and the kind of the colonizers, the stuff that you don't necessarily want in the garden, they can have a viability of up to 90 years, which is why anytime you see a bit of roadworks at the side, you'll see all the kind of the red poppy, the field poppy cropping up, and lots of what we would call the weedy seeds. Now, weedy seeds, really, the way I look at it, are wildflowers. They're only weedy seeds when it's in arable land or it's on your vegetable plot and they're displacing nutrient absorption and water and light from the other plants that you want to grow. Again, because of what this group is involved in, you will be sowing wildflower seeds, and there's a couple of tricks to that, but it's also the fact that the wildflower seeds that you sow, even if they don't germinate within a couple of months, or they don't germinate this year or next year, they could maintain a viability in the soil for a long period of time. And it could be that in a year or two, stuff that you had sown, somebody might dig over that corner or something might get planted, and then up comes all of your oxeye daisies or your scabious or your field poppy and whatever else. So don't be disheartened if you do sow a wildflower meadow and not everything comes up in the first year, because again, they will be a mixture of annuals, perennials, and biennials. So they all, apart from taking different levels of time to germinate, they all also take different levels of time to come up and flower and set seed for the next period of time. But eventually, over a couple of years, they will find their own rhythm, and you will find that you will have what it looks like on the packet will eventually come in. While I'm talking about wildflower seeds, the trick with wildflower seeds is that they really like poor soil. They've evolved in low nutrient soil. And the big mistake often that people get is they just take all the grass off the front garden and decide they're going to turn it into a wildflower meadow. But they've been feeding that grass for the last 10 or 15 years, and the nutrient layer below the grass is too rich for their wildflower meadow mix to survive in. If there's too much nutrient content in the soil where the wildflower seeds are being sown, they get fed fairly on when they germinate. They can go too leggy or put on too much leafy growth, and the auxins and plant hormones within the chemical components of the plant forgets about what it's meant to do, which is flower and set the next seed, and it's more about extending more roots and putting on more leafy growth. So the way to denude your fertile soil is if you can put a scattering of sawdust. So sawdust is an interesting thing. Sawdust, as it breaks down, to facilitate its decomposition, it steals nitrogen from the soil around it. So that's nitrogen is the fertilizer compound of your soil makeup that causes leafy growth. Potassium and potash is what causes flowering and fruiting, which is often when you buy a fertilizer or a liquid feed, it'll have NKP. Even if that's a liquid feed that's made from comfrey and nettles, it doesn't have to be. I'm an organic gardener. I don't use the kind of the chemical compounds that formerly made the ammunitions in World War I and World War II. But even if you get an organic feed, it'll still have the NPK on the side of it, and that's used for fertilizing different aspects of your garden. But if you can oversow your seeds with some sawdust, that will strip enough nitrogen out year 1 and year 2, and then after it breaks down, it puts nitrogen back into the soil. So it's a way of, instead of trying to impoverish your soil by turning it over and trying to bring up subsoil and getting rid of kind of the macro layer in terms of letting the earthworms and the beetles disappear away for a year, which will happen when you turn your yellow soil up, which will make your wildflower germinate and do their thing for a year or two, but then you'll have impoverished soil for a good few years until you build up the humus layer. Use the sawdust trick. So the viability of seeds in terms of now, if you are growing on vegetables or organic perennial plants, most of the seeds that you will get in your seed packets will have all of the information written on the back about the depth you sow, about whether you sow them on the surface or underneath, and the time of year in which you sow. So if you get a package of seeds now and it says February, sow in February, it's not too late to sow. If you get a package of seeds and it says something like sow in May, but you really want to sow in April, if you sow indoors, that basically means the temperatures that will be around now in your polytunnel, in your lean-to glass houses, and of course on your windowsill, will steal you 4 to 6 weeks. So it's effectively the only difference between sowing indoors and sowing outdoors is that indoors you're generally let's call it undercover. That means that you're generally sowing into a seed tray. So you're either sowing into something like this, your standard seed tray, which you will, fill with compost up to a layer. Sow your seeds on top. I'll talk about the different seed styles in a minute. And then sow your seed, that's grand. Or you may sow it into kind of modular trays. The handy thing with modular trays is you can use a pencil underneath to, I grab a pencil, to pop out the seed, so once it germinates, you can just lift it out easy for transplanting it on. When it's in the seed tray, you need to wait until the first 2 leaves that form, the next 2 leaves that form are what's known as the true leaves, and you can use them then to lift it out and move it on. It's often called pricking on, where you prick it out and you move it on into the next size up. So sown indoors is a little bit more labor intensive, but you can modify all of the conditions to make sure you get a high germination rate. It's easier to keep track of kind of your watering regime and all of the stuff that it says on the back of the seed packet. It's easier to manipulate germination. Sowing outside is often direct sowing, and that's where you have to prepare your fine soil tilt so that the seed will be received easier. Now, here we go again. This is getting back in terms of what the fertility of your soil is. So seeds, because they have the endosperm, they have that battery, they're ready to go. They don't really need a lot of nutrients. So in your soil, that's your garden soil, when you're sown direct, they have a lot of nutrients there. You sow them in, they will take off, they will go. That's okay. Some of them may get very leggy very quickly. Some of them mightn't. Again, it depends, because they're dealing with fluctuations in temperature. They're dealing with how hard it may rain on a particular day. We could still get frost, we're not guaranteed to be clear of frost until it gets into May. So we still have a whole month where seeds we sow at this point, if they germinate in the next couple of weeks outdoors, they could be hit by a sharp frost and killed off. So the indoor or the undercover is the tried and tested gardener method. Now, your friable soil, right? What you want to sow into is you want to sow into something light. So traditionally what people do is they would use, there's lots of different commercial composts. There's the John Innes Foundation, who come up with different structures of soil based on whether it's a seedling, whether it's a seed mix, the next mix from moving on, and they just have different levels of nutrients contained within them. We don't sow into peat. A lot of people, in the kind of commercial horticulture section would sow directly into peat. I have a problem with peat because it's wrecking the bogs, but I've also a problem with peat because peat dries out very quick, and then when you water it, it gets soaked. So it's always expanding and contracting. So plants that are in pots full of peat or that are in modular trays, because of that contraction all the time, the roots that are getting to the edge of it all of a sudden contract because it's now dry, move out because it's wet. And I think it just messes up with the energy of the plant. There are lots of alternatives to peat that we can sow our seeds into. Quard is one of them, which is a kind of it's ground up coconut fibers, but you can get peat-free mixes in your local garden centre. The reason why I would kind of recommend that is, as opposed to using your compost off your compost heap, or is because it's so fine and it's so light. And really what you want when your seed germinates, it will send out a radical root first and then it shoot next. If it's light, airy soil, the root is easier to get out and spread out, and it sends out an anchor root first to hold it in place, and then it sends out its feeders. The quicker it does that, the quicker your seedling is going to mature and thrive and move on. But also when it sends out the top shoot, you want that to be able to just simply push its way up through the soil and be off and start photosynthesizing and do its thing. If it's garden soil, it's much, much heavier. So it's more of a clunky process for the roots to do their thing and for the shoots to do their thing. If it's homemade compost, that again, that can be heavy and stodgy. There can be different types of particles in it. We will take a look at composting later on because, you know, leaves don't break down under the same structure. Leaves need fungal energy to break down, whereas your kitchen scraps need bacterial energy and heat. And very often a lot of people make the mistake of how they layer their compost. They layer it in ways that it stopped here, it started there. So we'll look at that in another class later on. The only thing that you can do is sieve it, you know. So if you have a sieve, even if you have a kitchen sieve that you use for kind of dusting the top of the sponge cake or whatever, you can run your kind of your homegrown compost through that and make it into friable. The smaller the particles, the better for the seeds. But you can get your mix. And again, you can, you know, once you buy your first layer of mix, you can see what it should look like if you're then choosing to delve into your homemade compost. So the light and airy, really, that's what you need in the mix to let it get off. Once it then germinates and it comes through and you're ready to move it on to the next level, which is, you know, most seeds can take about, you know, when you sow them at home, they will take maybe 3 weeks. And again, it'll say it on the back of the pack, it'll say 7 to 21 days, or, you know, it'll say may take longer. If it's not up within 2 months, it hasn't germinated. So this again, the secret to get it to germinate is once this coating naturally breaks down, the moisture gets in. It's called imbibition. The moisture gets in and that kickstarts the embryo to go. If you remember when I spoke about the Indian shot and some of the seeds with these harder coats, you need to break the coat, because that's designed to take 2 or 3 years to germinate, and you want it, you know, you want it for this summer. So what you can do is you can get something like an emery board and you can scratch the outer coating, which will start it to break down quicker, and that'll allow the moisture in and it'll take off. There is a technique where you can nick seeds with a little penknife, but you don't want to be going into the embryo because then you're going to damage it. So I'd rather, you know, a little scrape of an emery board or a bit of sandpaper, you know, you're not going too deep, and that's sorted out. That's called scarification. And there's another S word, which is stratification. And that's this thing where lots of seeds, because they have this time mechanism built in, they would require a winter period, a cold period, to break down that hard coating. Now, some people, even though it may say on the seed packet, sow your viola seeds in February, lots of people sow them in autumn and winter time, leave them in the ground and allow them go through a natural stratification. They allow them have the winter, and then in springtime, they will germinate up. If we're sowing our viola seeds on our windowsill, they probably have been pre-treated by the seed company, as in pre-chilled, and then when you sow them, that's okay, it's done. One of the tricks that a lot of gardeners do is they'll get their package of seeds and they literally put it in the fridge for a couple of weeks before they get to sow, and that tricks the seed into believing it has gone through a cold method. Now, that can be put the packet in the fridge, grand. The advanced method of that is to get a paper towel, moisten it, sow your seeds onto the paper towel, fold it over. You can put it in a plastic bag or a clear jam jar and leave that in the fridge. Now, not the freezer, the fridge, for 3 weeks. Take it out, and then you can either cut around the paper towel and put them into your tray, or you can carefully take them off with your fingers or even the tweezers and sow them as you're going. And that's the cold stratification, means it's ready to go. Stuff like hawthorn, just in case if you were trying to, you know, sow a wildflower hedge or something, lots of those kind of slow berries, hawthorns, elderberries, they generally take 2 to 3 winters to break down. So with them, the trick is you actually put them in the freezer for a week, in the fridge for a week, in the freezer for 2 days, in the fridge for 2 days, and then back to the freezer, back to the fridge, and then you sow them. Now, it's a lot of work, right? And it's a lot of remembering. And there's often times where you're going to make a soup and you're going for the frozen peas, and all of a sudden you have a jiffy bag full of kind of seeds that you forgot. Oh my God, I forgot to do them, and they've been frozen solid all the way through. They're not going to germinate. They're going in the bin. So the fridge method, the top drawer, the little crispy tray where you keep your kind of vegetables and stuff like that, that's handy. Just keep them in a Ziploc bag, put them in, keep the dates in your mind, write stuff down. So that's the stratification thing. So when you're sowing your seeds, now I'm bombing along because there's lots to kind of cover, but when you're sowing your seeds, there are three methods generally. So the first is called broadcast, and that's where you just literally, you broadcast, you scatter your seeds across the top of the surface. The next one is called stationary. That's where you might space a seed at intervals. And again, the seed packet will often say on the back, space out at 5 centimeters or whatever. And then the other one is pinch method. And that's where you kind of prick your finger in, leave a little hole, and you might just, like a pinch of salt, you might put 2 or 3 seeds into each to let them germinate. The rule of 3 thing is, like, there's lots of stuff in gardening that comes from a time when we had a mystical participation with gardening. So there is this saying, one for the pot, one for the soil, one for the worm. And that was that thing that, the worm might steal one, the pot might kill one off, but the other one for the soil would germinate. So people got used to planting in terms of trees. Now, trees, the tree, that's a very mystical thing. It's not just like, it's in every religion, tree is quite sacred and stuff like that. And specifically in Irish culture, like, we have triads, we have triple beats on the Bowron, we have the shamrock, and the interesting thing with the shamrock is that the shamrock, part of its mystical thing was, there was a time when we ate the shamrock to cause because bitterness really causes the brain to think it's being poisoned, because most poisonous plants are bitter. So by Irish people eating the shamrock generally at this time of the year, so before St. Patrick said kind of wear it, we ate it. It caused the gallbladder to release more bile, which broke down toxins and fatty substances in the body. So that was the original detox. So the shamrock also has stuff where it does night movements, its leaves close up in the dark and all that sort of stuff. And then by being the tree, like the trefoil spiral that's on the side of Newgrange and that sort of stuff, it just held as something special. And shamrocks and clovers and that sort of stuff add fertility to the soil. They're in the leguminous family. So when you're trying to improve your allotments, we might look at this later on when we're looking at improving soil fertility, there are certain plants that you can plant that will contribute nitrogen and other chemicals into the soil to improve your plants and how they grow. So the tree thing, that can be the little pinch thing, that can work. But what that brings you on to is your next stage after they germinate and grow. Now, how I like to sow is, no matter which method I use, whether it's broadcast or station or the little pinch, after then, are you going to cover with vermiculite? Do you need to leave it exposed to the surface, or do you give it a kind of dusting over with more compost? Once you answer that question, the next thing to do is to water it. So how I like to water is, I like to get the seed tray and sit it in a basin so that it soaks the water from up. If you go over, even if you have a fine rose on the top of your watering can, you can displace the seeds and move them around. So if you're sowing a seed and you're trying to make sure each one is evenly spaced, and you're even doing this thing with kind of 2 fingers between each to make sure they're evenly dispersed, if you water with top, you'll get little rivulets of water and it'll move away and seeds will butt up against one another and the whole lot. So watering from underneath is a gentler way of watering the plant. It gets the moisture up and through. The seed will soak up what it needs to soak up, and it hasn't been displaced in any form. Then what you need to do is you need to think about what heat now is required for this. Again, on the back of the seed packet, it might say, oh, this needs 6 degrees, or this needs 21 degrees. So at this time of the year, we have the vernal equinox. It's generally the 21st of March. And that's where the sun and earth kind of, their realignment moves in, and the soil temperatures and the ambient temperatures get warmer. Now, what happens, why it's called the vernal equinox, is because the vernal event happens. At above 6 degrees, stuff germinates and things start to grow back again. Below 6 degrees, not much happens. So that's, well, I mean, we say that, but you know, you could still have dandelions in flower on Christmas Day, and you could still be cutting your lawn on New Year's. Still some growth happens, but the majority of growth ends when we get below 6, which is generally late autumn, the start of winter, and we have a dormant period, doesn't come back until this time of the year, and everything is ready and primed to go. Those seeds that would normally flower in the middle of July when it's 18, 19, 20, 21 degrees, they may need you to get a propagator. So the propagator could be something as simple as your seed tray, and it's your plastic container that goes over the top, or a plastic bag, or even a sheet of glass. If you have a deep tray and you can move it up on either side, say stick 2 clothes pegs in even, and put your sheet of glass across the top of it, that generates enough extra heat, keeps enough moisture in for those to germinate quickly. If you do sow it in a pot and you put the plastic bag over, it steams up pretty quickly, and it's very difficult to tell whether your seed is germinated or not, and you're often having to open it up and take a look in and wherever. Those that need a sustained 21 degree or 22 degree, that's where you might want to buy a heated propagator, which you plug in and you set the thermostat on it, and it's even all the way through, and you just know, okay, in the 7 days or the 14 days or the 21 days, it's going to be up and germinated. Most of my seeds I would either sow in a cold frame outside in seed trays at this time of the year, or on my windowsill. You know, now the windowsill is full of kind of yogurt pots and all sorts of stuff, because I'm taking clippings and cuttings and everything is, it's all go. It's mad at this time of the year. So it's handy to be able to extend your options and do other stuff. And it's really just up to your own personal choice and expense. You know, propagators, some of them are really, really expensive, but the little ones with trays on top, especially if you buy, I mean, there is this complication, how much more plastic do we need in the world? But if it's a really hard-wearing plastic, you can have a propagator for 20 or 30 years before you're even having to think about recycling it. If it's a little cheapy one, that's a bit flimsy, it could break next season, and what a waste, you know. But again, you know, there was a time when you would use maybe the plastic sheeting that came back from the dry cleaning, and you could cut it up into size, and, you know, use the wire hangers and make little overlap tents over your seed trays. But the right temperature, that's the next key. So it's the right light, the right depth, the right growing medium. If it's too clunky, it won't come through. And then temperature. Once that happens and it germinates and you've given the right spacing, either way, if you've grown it in a seed tray or you've grown it directly into the soil, only if you've used modules, you're able to move stuff on yourself. But if you've sown it into a seed tray or into direct soil, you're going to have to tin it and space it out. So one of the things about tinning is if you're growing something like carrot, on the day where you're tinning it, the aroma of the carrot seedling as you pull it out is so strong that every carrot fly in a 2-mile radius perks its nose up and comes to your garden to get it, which is often why people will sow carrots. This is where companion planting came from, and we'll look at this later on. Would sow carrots with onions, because the onion deters the carrot fly, and then when you're tinning your onions with your carrots, the carrots deter the onion fly. So you're putting different aromas into the air to confuse the pests from coming and attacking your crops. This thing with the modular and the single sowing, lots of roots, and a lot of vegetable roots in particular, don't like to be disturbed when you transplant them on from your seed tray into the garden. So for stuff like peas and parsnips and anything with a long taproot, I like to sow them into loo rolls. So you have your loo roll, sow them in the top. Your loo roll can all be stacked up inside your seed tray. And the loo roll, because it's cardboard and it's biodegradable, you can just plant it straight into the garden. You're not having to take it out and plant the roots into the ground and backfill and water in and hope and pray that it hasn't been damaged and your plant isn't going to fall over in 2 or 3 days. So that's a good trick. You can buy root trainers. They're generally plastic and they fold up in a way and you can sow into that. But why not use the inners of your kitchen roll and your loo roll? Why not buy even, you know, if you want to be eco-friendly, you can buy these pot making kits that you make out of newspaper, you know. I wouldn't be making stuff out of magazines because the magazine ink is different to the newspaper and the magazine ink can be a little bit toxic to plants. So I'd stick with the kind of, you know, the Southside People or the Northside Post or whatever comes in the door, you know, and fold it up and make it that way. There is a thing when you sow seeds that no matter what your soil media is, like you should always thoroughly wash out your seed trays and your modules. Sudsy water does the trick. What you're trying to do is you're trying to get rid of any bacterial matter that may be there from a previous sown and clear it out. Some people recommend using bleach and all that sort of stuff. You don't need to go that far. Sudsy water will do it for you. But contained within most growing medias, there can still be bacteria. And one of the common causes of seedling fatality is a thing called blackleg. So your seed will sow, it'll germinate, up it comes, it's grand, it's 2 leaves are out on the top, it's grown away, and then 2 or 3 days later you come in and you notice that the stem is no longer kind of luminous green or dark green. All of a sudden it's gone black, and then bang, your seedling falls over. So it's like, you know, on Gortamur, it's like the famine. It's a type of a blight and everything is gone. And it's disheartening, you know, it's disheartening when you sow a seed tray and you see everything come up and you have that, you know, exuberance and joy of, you know, you're going to extend your garden and isn't life wonderful, and the awe experience of gardening, and then you come in and everything is gone. One of the tricks that I found over the years is that the Romans 2000 years ago used chamomile. They used the plants to plant beneath their apple trees in their orchards because the azulene that's contained within it is an antibacterial agent. It's a volatile oil, and it would be absorbed into the apple trees and it would make its way to the apple flowers. If fruit is basically a pregnant flower, the fruit would absorb the azulene too into its system, and it meant that the apples that they grew had less scab and less black spot and brown spot and other complications that stopped them from being stored for a long period of time. So chamomile means ground apple. It's what they put in the ground where the apples grew. So I have some chamomile here, and basically what I do is I'll harvest the flowers off my chamomile, dry them out, and when I'm sowing seeds, I'll make a chamomile tea. Now you can get it from your chamomile tea in your local health store or your local supermarket and do the same thing. I just find that with the actual flowers, there's just a lot more of the azulene and other contents contained within it. So you make your pot of tea, let it cool down. When you sow your seeds, you can use that either to water them in, or you can use that in the basin to let it soak and come in. And the constituents of the chamomile coats the outer region of the seed, so prevents it from bacterial infection, and it neutralizes out your growing media, your soil. The other trick you can do is you can pour boiling water over your soil, which would kill off any nasties that's in it. Or the other trick that you can do is you can put it in the oven and cook it for 20 minutes. The only problem is the next time you cook apple tart, it's going to taste like soil and your kitchen is going to smell of soil. So I would go either with the boiling water on the soil long before you sow your seed in as a sterilizing technique, or use the chamomile. Now the chamomile also has other nutrients contained within it that can benefit the plant. We'll look at this in another session down the line, how you can use garlic in the garden, how you use chamomile, what you can do with thyme and all that other stuff. So we'll look at the plant chemistry and how that benefits us. So the biggest problem is the black leg. So if we can get rid of that by using this sterilization method, then we'll have a lot more seeds there that will be viable and productive. The moving on bit, that's where you're trying to take care to make sure you don't damage the root at the base. Very often you'll go from a seed tray to a small diameter pot And then maybe in a couple of weeks, you'll go up to a larger diameter pot. At that point, you're looking to acclimatize the plants to the climate that's outside so that they're ready to go and plant. Generally, how you do that is you leave, like on a day like today, if you've sown your seeds back in February to mid-March, on a day like today, you might leave them outside of the cold frame or outside of the polytunnel or off your windowsill in the front garden for the day, and then take them in the evening and do the same tomorrow and do the same for about 2 or 3 weeks. And slowly but surely they thicken up and they get used to the fluctuation temperatures and they become hardy enough to plant outside. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to train them to be hardy enough to go from the indoor, secure, protected environment to be able to cope with climatic conditions outside. Sometimes what can happen is, here we go.
Fiann, we're about 45 minutes in now, but you have a bit more time.
Yeah, I'm almost there. So when this, so the seeds germinate, you're trying to harden them off. One of the other kind of complications that can happen with sowing all of your seeds indoors is that after they germinate, they can get a bit leggy. Etiolation, it's called, and it basically means that they've done their bit, but there's either too much light or too much heat, and they're growing faster than they would normally grow outside, so they can get thin and spindly. If they fall over and make contact with the soil, they can rot away. But even at that, if they're too spindly, when you're trying to prick them on, they snap in the middle and they're gone, So to avoid that, the hardening off process is also a way, because what they need to germinate is the right light, the right heat, the right depth of planting. But what they need when they become seedlings is air movement and fluctuations in temperatures to rigid up their cellulose structures and be ready to go into the garden. So there's no harm even with seed trays that you're sowing now, even before you prick them on. If it's a gentle day and it's not too breezy, move them outside and let free air to circulate around. If they're just on your windowsill, it's only when you open the window where they get a bit of that. Again, if you're doing it in bathrooms and kitchens where the shower is on or the kettle is on, the moisture levels, the steam and wherever else that's there, that can have an impact on the plant, and that you're training it to be used to high humidity, and then all of a sudden it goes out into the garden 3 dry days and it wilts. So pricking on and moving on and acclimatizing, that's the key to the success. Once you get through the germination, which it's programmed to do if you tick the right boxes, the hard bit then, and this is now where you're becoming a gardener, is your duty of care to what you do following on. This thing about the apple not falling too far from the tree, once they're hardened off and you want to plant them out, you want to get the right spacing. You want to space them far enough apart that they're able to extend their roots out and fully mature to the proper width that they're meant to do. Now, again, if you're doing this in terms of for food production, well, your seed packet will tell you what the planting out spacing should be, how far apart your leek should be, or how far apart your tomato should be. And basically that shows that the 2 plants growing close together are casting shade on one another, so they're not photosynthesizing to their full potential. So you move them apart. Of course, if you move them apart, there's more space between for weeds. But generally, that's why we grow in rows, because you can just get your hoe and hoe straight through. If you're broadcast sown into the garden, you're having to thin out in a different pattern. One of the tricks, so that, once your soil is disturbed, the weed seeds that have this viability of up to 90 years, they may be exposed to the light and germinate. So when you rake over your outdoor patch to sow your lovely seeds, whether it's wildflowers or whatever. If it's wildflowers, it doesn't matter if the weedy stuff comes in because it fits in. But if it's ornamental vegetables or productive vegetables or ornamental garden plants, the issue is how can you tell the difference between that, your good seedling that you want, and your weedy seedling? So often what I do is, if I'm sowing outside direct into the soil, I'll make a rill in the shape of an X or an O or a square, and I will sow into that shape so that I know anything that's outside of the X is a weed and I can just pick it out by hand. So if you don't want to sow, I mean, I remember a guy telling me he was actually in the army at the time, never be too regimented in the garden because you'll end up getting deserters. So there's that thing about if you always want your neat row all of the time, that, there's a practicality to that. There's not necessarily a nice aesthetic to that. So, but in the X's and the O's, when you're tinning out, then you're tinning out to find space. So you might not want to, after you've sown, when you read the seed packet and it says, keep them a foot apart. You might, if you tin everything, you'll only be left with 2 seedlings in your X. So as you move stuff on, you can actually plant them out further too. So generally your first set of tinning is just where this tree germinates so close together that their roots are going to entwine, tin them back to 1, and then try and leave a few inches space between the next batch and a few inches between the next batch. As they mature up and become more proper plants, you can then dig them up, transplant them on, and get them to their foot apart or meter apart or whatever the required distance is to let that plant flourish and grow and mature to its full potential. So that's kind of seeds 101 to get you from kind of start to moving stuff on. Yeah, I don't think I've left anything out, but we can check now on the questions and I'll find out where I went wrong or what I need to know.
That's fantastic, Fiann. Really, really good. We've about 6 questions at the moment, so I'll just give them to you one by one. The first one there, how about sowing indoors and putting the very same container outside in a while, as that saves replanting? She's talking specifically about patio gardening there.
Yeah, and again, the only thing is when you sow into your seed tray, if you've used kind of your seeding compost is only there to get it to germinate. Your seed becoming a seedling will last in that for maybe a week to 2 weeks. And then you're looking to move it on into a better quality compost. So if you sow inside and up it comes, and then you move it out later on, that's grand. You're acclimatizing it, you're hardening it off, but you still need to remember that it's not to grow in that condition for too long. So you're still going to have to be looking at some point to be moving around into other pots. Yeah, the thing with plastic is plastic is grand for germinating your seeds and getting them there. We've no choice. I mean, there are a couple of alternatives, but they tend to be disposable and they kind of disappear after a season and they're gone. You're trying to get it again. You can sow into a cornflakes box. You can sow into toilet roll holders. There's a way of being ecological about it when you're doing it. If you're growing patio plants, that's grand. You can grow them on any container. When it starts to get into the hotter weather though, if it's kept in plastic, it will sweat the roots. It can get too hot and it can damage your plant, and your plants can go into stress and shock, and that means it can wilt quicker than other plants that are grown in a terracotta pot or a ceramic pot. So if you're doing your patio garden, start thinking about nice pots, like attractive looking pots, but also pots that you're going to be able to put a bit of real soil, even real soil with a bit of manure and a bit of compost in, and maybe grow perennials. Everything doesn't have to be an annual. That if you can provide the environment contained within that, I mean, it's called container gardening, your plants are contained within that. If you can provide that with a rich growing medium, then there's all sorts of stuff you can grow. You don't just have to be dealing with annuals, give them a season and they're gone.
Great, thanks, Fiann. Next question, could you give some guidelines on watering once the seeds are planted?
Yeah, so by seeds, I'll answer that 2 ways. Seeds that are sown require a constant level of moisture until they germinate. And then they need, now not soggy, not waterlogged. If your mix is soggy or waterlogged, it's an anaerobic condition. There's no oxygen getting to the roots, and the roots can't take in their nutrients and they die off. When the seeds then are up to seedling stage and beyond and are moved out, pretty much the first 2 to 3 weeks, you need to be keeping an eye on them and making sure they're not starting to wilt. So basically plants transpire. This is how they photosynthesize. They basically perspire water out of their system through tiny pores in their leaves, which opens up the leaf and allows the leaf take in carbon dioxide, which it synthesizes under the power of the sun and with water to produce natural sugars, glucose within its system to grow. So if its pores aren't opening and closing, it can't photosynthesize. So if you overwater a plant or underwater a plant, it can't open, it can't breathe, basically. But the first 3 weeks is key. Thereafter, your radical roots will find the water table in your garden and it's able to manage its own watering. Now, if your garden is being bone dry for a month, you're going to have to, hose bands or not, you're going to have to figure out some way of watering your garden. Water butts are brilliant. I have an old bathtub down the back, which every now and then ends up with frogs, but it's just handy to be able to go down and put the watering can in and find a plant that's on the wilt. Some plants, when you move them on, if you've been doing this thing where you're moving it to a bigger pot each time, and you've been doing it over a whole year before you planted it in the garden or you planted it in your container, it can be so used to growing in pots that when you plant it into real soil, it can get a thing called transpiration shock or transplantation shock, which means it basically goes into shock and it faints. The quickest way to remedy that is to get a multi-B complex, that you take yourself for your physical energy and your stamina, crush it down, put it in a watering can full of water and water in with that, and the B vitamins help it perk itself back up. The other trick with that is Epsom salts. Epsom salts contain magnesium. Magnesium is required for the plant to photosynthesize. It's what makes the little chloroplasts, the little green parts in the plant, to bring it up. So if you when you transplant your plant on, give its first 2 or 3 waterings with a tablespoonful of Epsom salts into say a gallon of water, that's enough to make the plant its own immune system and its own internal functioning to be, it's a baraka boost for the plants. That's the best way to put it.
Brilliant. Next question, Fiann. Is it useful to move seed pots out of shadow into light to follow the sun?
Yeah, you can do that. See, this is the thing where, especially if you're getting that gangly growth, that can be that there's too much light going on, especially if it's gangly growth and it's kind of a light pale green, there's a lot of light happening. If it's gangly growth and it's white, if you think when you're chitting your potatoes, you really want to just chit it into a bud. I've seen even television programs, I've seen them planting a potato with a chit that's like the length of your arm. That's just going to break off, forget about it. But they're often white. So if you go to the veg press and you take out your potatoes and you see that big white kind of spore on it where you've left it too long, that's stuff that has germinated in the dark. So it hasn't got the light in. So if you see white growth, that means it's looking for light. If you see green growth, it's looking for a bit of shade. Now that's only with the gangly stuff, but in general, in terms of acclimatizing and hardening stuff off, yeah, there's no problem moving between shade and sunshine and back in again. The way I grow stuff is I have what would you call it? I have a cold frame that's basically 2 windows that I borrowed from a skip many years ago, and they're just set up on concrete blocks. And I have it done at the back where there's a hinge so I can lift it up and stick a prong underneath it so that it keeps aerated. But when I lift the stuff, it can be a bit shady. When I lift it out, it gets a bit of sunshine. When I put it back in at night, it's warm enough to keep them going and they're not going to suffer from frost, which again is what we're talking about, is not until May. So by moving your plants around shade and sun, you're giving them that multi-exposure to different environments, and that's building their resilience. So you're doing right there.
Excellent. Next question. If you have a seed tray or pots that didn't germinate, can you reuse the compost?
You can, but again, if it's something like wildflower seeds, does it just mean that they didn't get enough moisture and enough heat, and the next time around they might? So that while you think you're sowing your brassica seeds, what's going to come up is your wildflower mix. But what you can do is you can sterilize that compost the chamomile might be strong enough if there's a serious problem in it at that point, as in if seeds have broken down and they've added a bacterial layer into the soil. But you can do the trick with the boiling water or you can do the trick where you cook it out, whether that's heating it up in your microwave or putting it in the oven with the pizza.
Okay. Somebody asked there in relation to when you said you could put some powder, some compost on the seeds. Could or you mentioned sawdust as well. Somebody said would powdered wood chippings work?
Yeah, and again, it's like very often it's just about the aesthetic of what the garden is. I mean, even when people use a lot of mulch, so if it's the reason why I say sawdust is it's so fine a particle that you as you're raking it over the soil surface, you're mixing it in with the soil, it gets evenly dispersed. It's stealing the same levels of nitrogen from all parts of your garden. If you get into higher chips, it will steal nitrogen from, so your germination rate might not necessarily be even, or the fertility span across the garden or the area might not be even. If you get into larger size chips, including stuff like mulch and things like that, like I appreciate mulch. It does its thing. It keeps the moisture in the soil, but it's also where slugs and snails lay their eggs. So with the larger chips, it can be, if they're left on the top surface of the soil, it can be problematic. If they're raked in well and evenly distributed, less problematic, but it can be an aesthetic thing too. The only thing I would mention about that is, like, there used to be lots of sawmills around the place and there isn't. So where do you get it? So you might want to be looking at it from a pet store point of view, where they have the sawdust chippings for whatever pets use the sawdust. I don't think it's litter trays. I think it might be kind of hamsters and rabbits and that sort of stuff. If you can get it from there, because then you know it's not coming from wood that has been chemically treated, because that you don't want to be adding those type of chemicals. So all these woods that are tannalized and stuff like that, that are treated to not warp, you know, the certain types of decking and poles that you would use outdoors for making kind of arbors and pergolas and that sort of stuff. They often come and they already have like a greenish tinge off them. They've been treated with chemicals. You don't want that type of sawdust on the garden. So finding your pure sawdust might be a bigger task, you know, but I would say that most of the pet stores would have that sort of stuff now at this point.
And a question about wildflowers. Somebody asks, I've been letting the grass grow in an area of the garden. Can I try wildflowers with the grass still there, or will that be too rich for them?
Look, some of the wildflowers will germinate anyway within that, but it's probably the soil is too rich. But separate than the soil being too rich, the grass will outcompete. So you're going to have to get, now maybe you're thinking in the back of your brain, well, I'm getting rid of the grass anyway. But if you weren't, some people like to try and sow a wildflower mix in amongst their grass and have what's kind of trendily known as a flowery mead. Now, flowery mead, we're going back to the kind of 1700s way of, that's what a lawn was. It was a flowery mead. It was a fake meadow before people stripped the wildflowers out and just kept and went with the lawn, you know, this monoculture of green. Now, I'm not knocking green lowers your systolic blood pressure. So if all you have is a lawn, there's a health benefit to having that. And a lawn, an average size lawn, gives off enough oxygen to keep one human being alive for a day. So when you're digging up your lawn, as long as you're not replacing it with kind of a concrete drive-in or paving, wherever you're replacing it with, you're still keeping an ecosystem going. You're still keeping humans alive and healthy on the planet. But sowing wildflower meadow into existing grass, the type of grass we have here will outcompete, and you'll only get very patchy, and the seeds that will germinate in, because the root structure of the grass is so they won't get to germinate. The next batch of seed won't get to germinate properly, and very soon the grass will just overtake. Unless you get a seed mix. So the wildflower seed mixes have all sorts of problems with them, because lots of the stuff is handed out and it says native wildflower mix, and you read the back of the packet and it's native to the Balkans. It's not native to Ireland. So you're introducing all sorts of stuff that our pollinators are not used to. I mean, some of them have things like marigolds, and you know, it looks lovely, but it ain't wildflower seeds. You know, it's a mixed annual, mixed perennial mix. it's a different aesthetic than a wildflower thing, but it's a different ecosystem than a wildflower thing. So some of those ones with the marigolds and the corn cockles and the scabious and all that sort of stuff in it, they will survive in your more fertile and more grass-based garden. But if you get an Irish or a native Irish wildflower mix, that, and not all of them have it, but some do, there's a plant called yellow rattle. And the yellow rattle is a grass parasitic plant. So where it grows, it feeds, it attaches itself to the roots of the grass and kills the grass off near it. So eventually when that grass is gone, the yellow rattle has nothing to feed on, it dies off, and all of your other wildflowers populate the space. So that's another way of kind of doing it. It's looking to make sure it has yellow rattle in the packet. But just be careful, because the provenance of where the seed comes from is really important, because otherwise you're just growing kind of mixed annuals, you know, and they've called it wildflower, you know.
Okay, thanks. We're pretty much at the end of the questions. There was one other question there about the average expiry date of seeds, and some packets have no information, but you did kind of cover that in your talk after that question was answered.
Yeah, I would basically take it that if it's a edible crop, you don't want to go beyond 2 years. If it's a wildflower mix, it might last 5 to 6 years. But pretty much when you get your seed packet, you know, even the ones that don't have an expiry date on it, you don't want to go pretty much beyond 2 years, just because it means that when you sow the seeds, you've gone from maybe a 60 to 90% germination rate down to less than that. Now, that's great, because 50 seeds sow out of a package of 100, that's 50 plants. You know, I think that's brilliant. I wouldn't be too, picky or finicky about that, but it just means that they're using up over that period of time, or they're weakening their endosperm, which, as I said at the start, is their battery to go. So it's not just that you're getting less plants, it's that you're getting less healthy plants from that growth. But that said, I wouldn't throw them out. That's the thing. I'd still try and germinate them, and I'd take my chances on it, because throwing it out is just a waste,
Okay, well, I think that's all the questions for now, Fiann. The comments are coming in that people really enjoyed it. Your passion and your knowledge of the subject is amazing. We're really looking forward to the other talks in the series. Good night, everybody. Thank you for
coming. I'm only getting started. God love you.
Well done. Good night.